Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. I'm your host, Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at Lady Leet, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ben Lesh. Hi, Ben.
Hey, how are you?
Very good. I'm so excited today because we get to talk to Evan Yu, who is the creator of Vue.js. Hi, Evan, and welcome.
Hi, great to be here.
So you have been working on so many amazing things lately. It's hard to keep up. I saw your tweet about how your GitHub has been kind of blasting off. Lots of dark green lately.
Yeah.
And just a lot of really fun things coming out of the Vue community. So it's so encouraging to see, like, even in times of COVID, that y'all are just going crazy. I mean, do you have more time? Are you more inspired because you have more time?
It's probably, honestly, COVID for me, the work is almost the same because I work from home before this. So work-wise, the environment isn't really that much different for me. But I guess it actually has a negative impact on me because my kids have to stay home. So I have to actually figure out how to, take care of them and deal with them all the time.
Yeah, I'm in exactly the same boat. I was working from home before all this, and now I'm working from home with kids that walk into my office.
With kids, yeah, exactly.
And here's me just wanting to get a cat.
They can be difficult too. They walk on your keyboard, and
That's true. So let's hop into, I guess we have to talk about Vue 3, of course, because that is kind of like the thing that is on everybody's minds when it comes to Vue. Love to kind of, talk about some of the key differentiators. What are you looking forward to? Why are you excited about Vue 3?
So I guess we can look at Vue 3 from a few different aspects. So what's interesting is I've kind of found, I always talk about balance when it comes to choosing or designing frameworks. And if you look at some of the most popular options right now, like React and the new kid on the block, Svelte, and Angular Vite, you kind of see a trend where React is putting more and more bet on the runtime side, where concurrent mode is all about scheduling things on the fly and trying to figure out the best way to do the work. And Svelte and Ivy and Ember in some way are sort of putting more bet on the compiler side. I still remember, the blog post Tom Dale wrote a long time ago, frameworks are becoming compilers and all that. So you take these template-based solutions, because of the existence of templates, gives the compiler more opportunity to do smart things ahead of time and produce more optimized runtime code, right? And in that sense, Vue is interesting because when we did Vue 2, Vue 1 was more like Angular 1, where we compiled the template and just directly worked with raw DOM. So Vue 2 adopted the virtual DOM so that we get the underlying ability of the flexibility of the virtual DOM underneath, but we still have the template, right? We're compiling templates into virtual DOM render code. And originally it was kind of a naive approach where it's more or less just like compiling JSX. Not much magic is done. But over time, we started to find more and more opportunities to optimize the compile output. So V3 is kind of so V3's design was started with all these knowledge that we gained while working on Vue 2, knowing that we have control over the runtime, the virtual DOM runtime. We also have complete control over the template to JavaScript compilation process. So if we design the runtime from the ground up, knowing that a compiler is available, we don't have to follow the traditional virtual DOM path. We can design a virtual DOM runtime that is aware of the compiler hints. We can design a virtual DOM runtime that, so essentially Vue 3, the unique point is we have a very, very optimized template compiler that can output very, very optimized runtime code, but at the same time, it's still a virtual DOM runtime. So if you decide that you want to get out of the template, just directly write virtual DOM code, render function, or even JSX, you can still do that. And it just fall back to fully dynamic diffing. But if you use the template, it just generates code that's much more optimized and does a lot less work at the runtime. So I think that is, architecture-wise, that's probably the most differentiating factor. Compared to, say, Svelte or Ivy, they mostly produce sort of directly emit imperative code that the user will have no control over. So it's kind of, the rendering is sort of a black box. You can't really say, I want to directly hand write the rendering instructions myself. It has to be generated by the compiler. But in Vue, it can either be generated by the compiler, or you can sort of take control and just do everything in JavaScript yourself. So I think like that's kind of the most defining part about Vue 3 in terms of rendering. And the other aspect is the state management side. So I think, again, this is interesting because React is more or less taking the immutable and pull-based approach, where it assumes whenever you change something, you send a signal to the root, and the root will try to figure out, you know, the whole tree, whether some part of the tree has changed, and try to diff all that. And I would say I would put that into the sort of more brute force diffing or dirty checking, because virtual DOM diffing, like the full diffing, is still sort of dirty checking. And Svelte is going more of the putting the reactivity into the compiler time. So it's just detecting your syntax and trying to generate code that, so let's say you have some state mutating code, Svelte will detect that and generate a code that notifies the runtime something has changed. So again, Vue is somewhere in the middle, where we still have our, you know, reactivity tracking system, what most people know Vue for. But at the same time, we sort of redesign the API. So a lot of you know about the Composition API, which is a whole new set of API exposed in Vue 3. A lot of people think of that as sort of a equivalent to React hooks, but surprisingly, when we were implementing Vue Composition API, there wasn't too much work to be done, because the internal reactivity system works exactly the same way. It's still wrapping your plain objects into reactive proxies and turning them into the reactive versions, and tracking property access on tracking the property access and tracking the property mutations, triggering changes as necessary. So the fundamental mechanism is exactly the same with Vue 2. And in fact, what we did is simply take some of the internal APIs, expose them, and they kind of become the Composition API. So it's just a more direct access to Vue's reactivity system, which is kind of a black box in Vue 2, which at the time was an intentional design decision, because we felt we want to hide as much magic as possible. But React hooks kind of showed that when you expose these primitives, it actually offers very, very powerful mechanism for composing state, even outside of your components. To realize, hey, like we already have all of this. Why don't we just expose it, and then we get something really, really with the same similar logic composition power as React hooks. So that's where the Composition API in Vue 3 came about. So yeah, so primarily Vue 3 is really about rendering. That's like combining the compiler and the runtime to get the best of both worlds. And in terms of state side, we're still taking, still like going from where Vue came from, the reactive mutable state objects route, but we're just exposing the internals to unlock new, more flexible ways to leverage it and compose logic across components. Yeah, I guess that's a lot, but I think that is primarily what Vue 3 brings to the table.
I think it's awesome. I think that from what I've gathered just recently, like, and I haven't actually used Vue, I'm sorry, in any meaningful way, but I feel like Vue's probably a little ahead of the game in comparison to contemporaries at the moment. As far as like the sorts of like Vue 2 using virtual DOM under the hood, the idea that you're getting to where you can expose some of these hooks. Like I worked on Angular and Angular Ivy, obviously. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that most frameworks under the hood, whenever hooks came out in React, like most people don't really realize that those sorts of hooks, like they exist in almost everybody's framework. It's just usually they're not exposed for people, or they're not exposed in any ergonomic way that you would ever want to really use them. So I think it's a pretty interesting choice. And I'm kind of excited to see how that rolls out.
Yeah. So I can sort of tangentially go into how Composition API differs from hooks. Like I don't want to be React bashing in this episode, but a lot of people sort of think when they see the Composition API, the Vue Composition API for the first time, they're like, oh, isn't this just React hooks? And there are some pretty fundamental differences. Like if you've used React hooks, you know they are, when you call use state, it's internally hooking into the current React component instance to get the state into your current closure. So every time your component renders, it captures a new closure of all these variables inside your component closure. So that is an intentional design by the React team because they want it to happen so that every time you render, you naturally have a closure that captured all the current state at that very time. So which is very concurrent friendly. So you can sort of assume this captured state is safe to be, say, deferred or distributed or scheduled to be computed at different times. So which is critical for concurrent mode. But that also creates a bunch of problems. For example, when you call use effect, you have to make sure you pass the correct dependencies to make sure these inner closures invalidate correctly. Which has been a kind of a usability problem. So they had to introduce an ESLint plugin to help to prevent people from shooting themselves in the foot. But at the same time, the plugin sometimes can be too aggressive to fix things automatically, and then that leads to the problem. Like when you are too correct, you invalidate things too often. And it kind of leads to performance problems because every time you create new variables, pass them down to child components, the child component just thinks, oh, the props have changed, I need to re-render. And if this happens at every level, you kind of have a lot of cascading component updates. When a parent component updates, it just like accidentally calls all its child components to update, and all the way down. And then that leads to the need to manually call use memo or use callback to cache these things.
Yeah.
So it's kind of going full circle in a way, right? So you are sort of creating some performance problems in order to be concurrent friendly, which was supposed to solve performance problems.
Yeah, I've complained that that it also kind of leaks in implementation detail too, right? Like, so if you have a component in React and you say it exposes some event, and you pass, in React, everyone wants to pass like an inline arrow function in the template. And so like the bit of that people don't understand is when they do that, they're creating a new function instance every single time.
Exactly.
And then inside you've got some use effect that wants to wire that up. For whatever reason, if you have a use effect that wants to wire that up, then you have this problem where your dependencies, that linter is going to want you to add that as a dependency, but it's going to do an instance diff on it, which means that every single time it renders, it's going to tear down that effect and wire it back up. So you have to know that in advance and put use callback on whatever you pass in, which means that you have to know implementation details of the component you're consuming.
Yeah.
So it's problematic.
Yeah. So this is something that Composition API it's a problem that we simply don't have because Vue 3 Composition API is set up once. And then it's just like normal stateful JavaScript objects. So you don't have the recreating identities on every render sort of problem. Another thing is like even inside templates, right? So you can write inline arrow functions in event handlers in Vue templates as well. So the Vue 3 compiler will actually generate code that caches the initial inline handler and reuse it on subsequent renders so that it never calls the child component to re-render. And it's smart enough to know whether your inline arrow function references a scope variable that may change. So if it references a scope variable that may change, it will preserve a new function on every render. But if it's sort of static, it's always referring to only the root component state, then this function doesn't have to be recreated on every render, and we'll just optimize it away. So you get the same function on every render. A lot of these minor performance problems, we just try to sort of solve it either at the API design level or just let the compiler optimize it away.
That's exciting. There's a,
Yeah.
I think the beauty about frameworks, and I think this is kind of why framework wars will never go away, is because we all learn from each other.
Yeah.
And as
Yeah.
you look at the new things that are coming out in all the different frameworks, you know, when you're designing, you're able to do better, you know, or think about all the sort of pitfalls
Yeah.
between this. And, you know, I'm sure that, I mean, who knows what framework will come next?
Yeah, I think like Vue 3, although it started sort of around the time, I think before React Hooks was announced, and also like before the time that Svelte kind of really caught on. But like because the design process was kind of long, like we actually sort of get to absorb a lot of the interesting ideas we found in React Hooks or in Svelte, which are both, you know, great technologies. But then in the same process, we kind of realized, hey, like, here's what we can do differently. Maybe we can do something we can take the good parts and then improve upon it and have some things unique in Vue that we can take advantage of to make this even better. So that's sort of the design process that Vue has always kind of followed. And I think, and I hope someday, like, we have things that, you know, other frameworks can sort of take inspiration from. I think like Vite is something that we hope that can benefit all frameworks in some way.
Yes, that I've seen that you've been very, very active in developing Vite, spelled V-I-T-E.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about Vite and what your hopes are for it?
Yeah, so I guess all of us developers today know Webpack, and inevitably most of us have used Webpack. And even if you don't use Webpack, you probably use a bundler in some way, like Parcel or Rollup or whatever. Like eventually you have to take all your modules together and put them together, right? So people have tried to use native ES imports to make websites. Unfortunately, there are just, at this moment, it's very hard to get the performance right in production because native ES imports creates a huge network request waterfall. So unless you have perfect HTTP2 push, it's just not going to load really well. So you still need bundlers for production. That's kind of a given fact. But do you really need bundlers for development, right? During development, what we are used to, the dev servers that we used to, say, for example, Webpack dev server, what it does is it's actually still bundling your code, stores it in memory, and then serve it to a page so that you can work on it during development. So every time, without hot module replacement, you're essentially generating a whole new bundle and reload that in your browser. So even with hot module replacement, there's still a lot of work because you're trying to verify you still have to the bundler still has to crawl the whole import graph and try to like determine what modules to update and what modules to invalidate. So that's still a lot of work. And more importantly, like whenever you start the server, the dev server, the whole project has to be bundled first before you can actually see it on the screen, right? So if you have a project with like maybe 20 screens, 20 routes, and each route has maybe 10 to 20 different components. So you have like close to 400, 500 components or modules in your application. All of these have to be processed, compiled, bundled first before you can start working on that single screen, which just doesn't make sense, right? So Vite builds on the premise that bundling is unnecessary during development, and we use native ES imports. Let the browser do the imports, right? So the browser becomes your import graph crawler. So your entry file, so every file is just served to the browser with their native ES module syntax, ES module import syntax. Just leave it. So the browser will import the things, send a request to the server. So the server will just grab the according file, compile them if necessary, right? Like the actual work we need to do is sometimes we need to rewrite the imports to support, say, importing from a node modules dependency. So we need to do some lightweight rewrite, but the rewrite can be done extremely fast by using ES module Lexer, which is a very great tool by Guy Bedford. So he wrote this, which is a blazing fast Lexer to find all the import statements in your ES module code. And we can essentially determine if there's no imports, we don't even need to touch this file. If there are imports, we simply check if the import is a bare import that the browser does not support natively, and then we will resolve the module on the fly and rewrite the import. So what your browser get is completely valid JavaScript with native ES import syntax, and the browser will make the according requests to the server. The server just sends back the right files. So that essentially gets rid of the whole bundling process. And it's also truly on demand, because say you're working on the current screen, when the server starts, it doesn't need to compile anything. The server just starts and it just waits for the browser to actually send the requests in. So the server always starts instantly. So when you work on that single screen, because the current screen only imports this many modules, only those modules will actually get compiled or need to get compiled, right? So this is what I mean by truly on demand. So you only ever compile the files that you need on the current screen to be able to start working on it. And then on top of that, Vite supports hot module replacement. And Vite's hot module replacement is extremely fast because we still do have to do graph analysis, but the graph analysis is kind of free because the browser already kind of does that for us. So we just basically record all the import relationships as we receive the requests. And then whenever a file change, we just send a message to the browser telling, hey, just reload this, re-request this module and all its dependencies. And we get blazing fast reloads, hot module replacement, not just full page reloads.
So this sounds pretty cool. Have you seen Snowpack at all? Like Fred Schott's thing? Is it very similar to that, or?
It is similar in some way, but our approach to how files are compiled is somewhat different. Snowpack 2, essentially you have you specify how you compile these files by using some build scripts, and it is essentially maintaining an in-memory file system that whenever you edit something, it takes that file, compiles it, and saves it in a in-memory file system cache. And when the browser requests it, it returns it. So it's kind of similar in that aspect, but Vite sort of is more opinionated in the sense that we try to mirror what people are used to in the Webpack ecosystem. So a lot of more things work out of the box. For example, we managed to get, say, relative file asset imports. So pretty much all the features you're used to in Webpack, like in CRA or Vue CLI, we managed to make it work with native ES module imports, plus hot module replacement, which Snowpack does not really support.
Are you going to be able to update Vue CLI to use Vite? Like, so if someone has an existing Vue CLI app, will they be able to, like, I'm assuming you're probably using Webpack or something under the hood right now.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to update?
So technically, if they don't use like esoteric custom Webpack tools, then they should be able to have the same source code and just work in Vite. Like if you take a newly scaffolded CRA app or a Vue CLI app and just put it into Vite, it should just pretty much work with maybe some minor tweaks, but most of the philosophy is the same. And then for production, we use this rollup to bundle it for production. So so the difficulty or the challenge of this approach is like you kind of have to duplicate a lot of logic between the dev server and the bundling. So we essentially sort of, for the end users, that's still invisible. It's just a bit more work on our side. But still, like it's surprisingly it's not as much work as I'd expected. So I think I started the project almost like 3 weeks ago, and I've got it to pretty much working. I even added a service worker to cache already compiled files. So when you reload the page, it doesn't need to even hit the server. And even if you hit the server kind of knows whether a file has changed or not. And if a file doesn't change, it just returns 304. So the browser will not really transfer anything from the server. So a lot of areas to further even optimize this. And in practice, it's just a much smoother, faster experience than having to wait for Webpack to bundle everything and then reload.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like there's been a lot more push to kind of move away from Webpack by various groups. Like I don't think that like React has any intent of doing that, but obviously like Angular has moved to Bazel for more googly reasons than anything else, because Bazel is essentially Google's internal build tool Blaze. But there's there's what you're working on, then there's all these other efforts like Snowpack and certain things like that. It's very interesting to me that it seems to be like a move away from that. Like I know that Webpack has been slow. What was the driving thing to kind of get away from Webpack? Is it just mostly the speed of the build, or?
It's first the speed of the build. The second is so I came up with the idea of the dev server first, and I added the bundling process later. And when I was adding the bundling process, I realized if we're already doing all of this, I think like Webpack just carries a lot of baggage from the CJS days, because Webpack was initially just built to bundle node modules, right? A lot of legacy required stuff, whereas a bundler like Rollup is designed with ES imports from the ground up. So Rollup is ES imports first, and CommonJS is kind of an afterthought. And that aligns with Vite's dev server, which is native ES module imports first. And CommonJS is kind of just like, you shouldn't really be using CommonJS if you're using Vite, right? So so I think that aligns really well. So it's not really a knock on Webpack. Webpack is still a very powerful, flexible tool. It's so flexible that you can pretty much bend it to do anything you want. But at the same time, you know, because of that flexibility, it induces all this complexity inherent in it. So it's kind of slow, even when you're just to do some simple stuff. So I think Vite is sort of this, if we can just get rid of all the CommonJS burdens and go from native ES module imports from day one, what would the dev setup be like? Can it be lighter? Can it be faster? Right? Can it be closer to the experience we had in the old days, where you start an index HTML, you write some files, you import them, and you just start a dev server, and everything just the box. Even TypeScript, JSX, TSX, PostCSS, CSS modules, all of these just work out of the box with zero configuration. It's also using ES Build underneath. ES Build is TSX, JSX, and ES next to ES compiler that that is written in Go. So it's native, and it's like orders of magnitude faster than all these JavaScript equivalents. So I did a bunch of benchmark and found out it's like, it takes only like 2 to 3 milliseconds to so if you put that behind a dev server, that's going to be a huge difference when you have a TypeScript-based project.
You still have to
So-
use TSC to do the type checking, though, I imagine, right?
Yeah, but do that from the IDE, right? So
Yeah.
if you already have your IDE to do the type checking, then having the dev server do that is just completely redundant, right? So
Yeah.
you should
I guess
use
you could just do that during like,
transpile.
yeah, just do it during continuous integration or something.
Is that a Vue project? Is that kind of like your own side project?
So it started out as a personal experiment, but I found it to be so promising that I think we're trying to steer new Vue users, especially people starting out with Vue 3. We hope this could be the default, just so much nicer.
So the one, as somebody that works on like a library and not necessarily a framework, one of the things that kills me personally though is like what we haven't gotten to, so is that a library author can publish, you know, say the latest and greatest JavaScript syntax, and then have other people down level it as they need to appropriately. Like,
Right.
I'm kind of beholden to publish like ES5 with, you know, whatever module syntax, but like it just adds so much more bloat that would not be there if people could just be like, oh, well, I've got the TypeScript files, or I've got the you know, whatever, and I'm just going to down level that myself.
That is in fact the default premise in Vite as well. So Vite
really?
doesn't exclude no dependencies for processing at all. Because it's so fast, it doesn't really need to. So when you do that, there are also ways to I do need to talk about the downside of using native ES module imports for development. That is, when you say you have a project that imports a huge dependency, like Lodash-ES, which if you import something from Lodash-ES, it imports 600 files directly in its main entry, right? So when you do that, your browser essentially are making 600 parallel requests to the server, which no matter how fast the server can respond, it still jams the network stack. So it kind of creates this like congestion at the network level. So some way to get around with that is like you can pre-bundle some of the dependencies into a single ES module. And interestingly, Snowpack does that. So in some ways, Snowpack can be used as a complementary tool alongside Vite to pre-bundle your dependencies into ES modules so that you get faster reloads during development. And yeah, so the philosophy in terms of like say downgrading stuff in Vite is Vite does not do any sort of compatibility stuff out of the box. It does not ship Babel, does not try to do auto prefixer or anything like that. It assumes you're targeting the latest and greatest browsers. But if you want to say downgrade, you should do that at the as a part of the bundling process, right? So we expose ways for you to add custom rollup plugins. So you can very easily write a rollup plugin that takes the final bundle chunks and then run Babel on top of that. Development, which again is, in my opinion, unnecessary.
So the go ahead, Tracy.
I was gonna say, so is Vite doesn't bundle, that's replacing bundlers?
No, it's more integrated build tool. I was struggling in defining it as well, right? Because it uses a bundler underneath. It uses rollup for production builds, it has a completely custom dev server for serving your source code during development. So it's sort of a dev server plus a build command together. So I'd say that's like, it's just a web dev build tool in general.
So it's not like an anti-bundler.
I don't know.
It's not like if you take a
it's not
bundler
anti-bundler.
and it's if you take a bundler and you take Vite and you touch them together, they won't explode. It's fine. It's not an.
It's kind of technically it's not mutually exclusive with the third-party bundler. Say like if you take the same source code and like feed it to Parcel, it could probably work, right? So that's the thing. It's interesting because say Webpack or even Rollup or Parcel, they're all eventually capable of doing bundling the same source code. So there is a common sort of conventional treatment of all these common files. Like if you import a CSS, all these conventions, all of these bundlers can be made to support. So if we kind of arrive on that common ground, so Vite will be able to serve that kind of code. And any bundler will be able to bundle that code as well. Vite uses Rollup by default. Configure Webpack to bundle Vite source code as well. So it's not really sort of exclusive in any way.
It's kind of fun because it's like, you know, why are bundlers called bundlers? Why are frameworks called frameworks? And then you're going to have to struggle with this whole idea of people will group it into the bundler category, I guess. Just like React, right? React is not a framework. It's just a library. A lot of those fun conversations in the future. Or maybe you need to just come up with like a word, you know, that describes
exactly
what it's doing. Like not bundler, but like what, you know, whatever that word is.
It's like something that, like some synonym for bundling. It's an amalgamator.
Yeah, it's funny because the other day I was talking with Gavin, author of Parcel, on Twitter, and basically pointing out like Parcel is actually not a bundler anymore. Parcel is trying to do much more than just a bundler. So it's more like it's almost getting into the meta framework territory where you just write source code and bundle. Parcel will like serve and build everything for you. And I think Devon eventually said he thinks you'll start to relabel Parcel as something called an application builder or application graph, whatever, which I think in some way is interesting because we are going into these, we're kind of growing outside of the narrow definition of what bundlers mean for web development. We're trying to get into these different permutations of build on top of that. And here's what you can do by adding a different dev server on top of bundler. Here's what you can do by, you know, taking a more opinionated approach and grow on top of bundler. So I think it's cool to have all these different ideas trying to explore it. I think there's still but I guess like we are kind of used to like web. I think it's about time that we start to sort of think resetting the expectation of what the development experience can be like.
I love that because I remember when Webpack was the new kid on the block and it was like, oh my God, Webpack is so much faster than all these other things. Look how awesome it is. And then, you know, a few years later now it's like, okay, let's start to rethink. But it's awesome that, you know, we're starting as an industry to start thinking outside of the outside of the box, you know, thinking about, you know, maybe it's not a bundle, maybe that's not what we need. Yeah.
So like, you know, I don't know, as long as it's easy to configure, because I'll be honest, every time I have to configure a build tool, I want to die, like on the inside.
So Vite is, at this moment, it does have a config format, but most of the stuff is just command line flags mapping to the config file. Like the default CRA app works with zero configuration. The default Vue CLI app works with zero configuration. Pretty much zero configuration. if you need like to configure post CSS, you just add a post CSS config file and it just loads it. So let's say if you're just starting a typical app, right? What Parcel did really well is like 90% of the common cases, it just works out of the box. You don't have to really configure much. And Vite is very opinionated in that regard. So if you just follow what Vite sort of suggests you to do in certain common scenarios, there's really not much you need to configure.
So
Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say I'm looking forward to it. And we're almost at time, but Ben, if you have another question.
So my question would be then, as like a library author, what, like, how should I publish my library to best behave with Vite?
Publish a single ES module file and point your pack.json's module field to it. So essentially, you still want to publish ES modules, but ideally you want to pre-bundle it using rollup.
So would deep imports be annoying then, I guess?
Deep, yes. It's supported if you want to do deep imports. The pre-bundling is only there to sort of improve the network performance, because when you have, it just creates congestion at the network level. But if you want to just like create maybe 4 to 5 split ES modules, that's also fine. That's not really a problem.
All right, well, that's good because we've got that in RxJS, so I was curious.
Oh yeah, in the same situation with Lodash-ES in that regard. So we may have to, that's actually the weakest spot of Vite right now, is third-party dependencies with a ton of imports. Yeah. We need to find a way to better optimize that. But yeah, other than that,
like 5. It's not too bad.
Okay. Yeah. As long as it's not like 600 files like Lodash-ES, it should be fine.
No, it's nothing like that.
Okay. Yeah. Then it should just work. Yeah.
Oh my God, Evan, I feel like we could talk to you forever about all the exciting things.
We haven't even talked about VitePress. Maybe we'll save it for another time.
I know. Well, I mean, everybody who's listening, definitely check out VitePress, because that's another exciting thing that Evan has been working on. And, you know, really excited about Vue 3, really excited about Vite as well. I'm curious about what we call this sort of like new category of technology. Just watching like all of our communities, right, like inspire each other, and I think Vite is really going to start inspiring everyone else, you know. So
yeah, I mean, if it doesn't end up, my hope is like, even if it doesn't end up being the new sort of like hottest, newest, like greatest tool, like I think this direction is definitely worth exploring, and I think future generations build tools should definitely sort of consider this as approaches. Yeah.
No, I love it. Well, very cool. You can follow Evan on Twitter at Yushi. Did I say it right? I'm always.
Yeah, it's pretty close.
And you know, if you want to hear any more Modern Web podcasts, feel free to check out modern.web. What is the website name? I think it's modern.web.com. Anyways, if you search Modern Web Podcast, you'll find it. That's pretty terrible. We've been going through a revamp, so I'm confused now even of what we name our things. And you can follow Ben on Twitter at Ben Lesh, and we'll see you on the next Modern Web Podcast. Thanks for listening.